So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about correlation visualization in Tableau. This is going to be very simple, but I just want to make sure that you understand a couple of very key concepts when we are visualizing scatter plots in Tableau. So we're going to do something very straightforward, and this might not make a whole lot of sense because obviously these things are probably going to be correlated, but we're going to do a scatter plot that shows the correlation between sales and profit. All right, so I'm going to drop sales into columns and I'm going to drop profit into rows, and we get one dot because what is this? Sum of all the sales for all the records, sum of all the profit for all the records, and we make one dot. Tableau has done exactly what we want it to do, because by default it aggregates up measures. Now, if you look on the analysis menu, which I'm going to click up here, when it pops down, you're going to see that there's a check mark here that says aggregate measures, and it's checked. I'm going to uncheck it. Now when I uncheck it, it actually creates a dot for every single record in the database, and we get a big mess here. Now this often works just fine because you often do want to show every record in the database, but sometimes you might end up thinking you're representing one thing when you're representing something else. So I don't generally recommend just choosing to turn off aggregate measures, so I'm going to undo. And we'll talk about how do we get the same kind of effect in a way that we're controlling exactly how many dots there are. Now, one very easy way to get every single order would simply be to drop order ID onto detail. And now we're going to get the exact same graph because you can't aggregate order ID because order ID is different on every single dot. And so whatever dimensions that you bring in here and place on detail, if let's say it was country or state, let's watch here. I'll take order ID off and I'm just going to drop state on. There's a lot fewer dots, right? There's only about however many states we actually have sales in, because that's the level of detail that I've brought into detail. All right, I'm going to undo that. Or if I put country into detail, well, all of these were actually in the United States, so we still only have one dot. I'll take that out, and city I'll drop into detail. And now I just get a dot for every city in which I have orders. But none of those are what we actually want. We actually do want to see for all of our orders what is the correlation between sales and profit. So I'm going to take order ID and drag it into detail. And now I get this big mess here. All right? But I do have my my x-axis and my y-axis, and I see the correlation. And it does seem that in general there is a trend, but let's see if that's true. Again, I'm going to go over here to the analytics pane, which we haven't used yet, and I'm going to choose to add a trend line. I'm going to click and drag it over here, and I get the linear trend line. Right? Now, if you wanted to, you could have come over here, drop the trend line, and you could have picked the one you want. Now in this case, I think the linear makes more sense. So we're going to go ahead and click that. And when you mouse over this trend line, you see that we have an R squared. The trend line has an R squared of 23.5% and has a p-value less than 0.0001, so it's statistically a significant trend line. That doesn't really matter for what we're doing right now, but I'm just showing you that you can always place a trend line into your data, but you should check to see if the p-value is low enough to see that it's statistically significant. You wouldn't want to illustrate a trend line that wasn't real, right? Now this is still kind of a mess for us. We've got just blue dots, everything else. Maybe instead of circles, it might be better to use, instead of the automatic open shapes, it might be better to use actually filled circles. Now we have dots that are easier to see, and maybe we can do a little bit more to this so that we can maybe see something that's a little bit more interesting. So let's go back to our data pane here, and let's take segment and drop it onto color. Now the cool thing here is when you drop another level of detail into the visualization, that now the trend line is going to be broken up by that level of detail as well. So it aggregates consumer, corporate, and home office, and it creates trend lines for each of those groups. Right? So it doesn't aggregate, it groups, and then it creates these trend lines. Now we've got a pretty reasonable correlation graph here, except we've got this big blob of data, and that's fine. I mean, it's what the data shows, right? But we might experiment just a little bit with making the size a little bit smaller, and you see there you do pull out a little bit more detail here, but it is kind of small to look at. And maybe we want to see is how could we encode another dimension in here? All we've really encoded so far is 3 dimensions: X placement, Y placement, and color for segment. But maybe there's some relationship between products that have low quantity might be higher profitable, have higher profitability because maybe we give quantity discounts. So why don't we drop quantity onto size and see if we see any patterns emerge? And now you'll see that some of the dots are real small and some of the dots are real big. And well, maybe we don't see any real relationship, but we have encoded a 4th dimension into our graph. All right. Correlation, you all have done this a million times. I'm just trying to really just illustrate to you how we do it in Tableau. Now the last thing I'm going to do in this is I'm going to duplicate this sheet. And I'm just going to show you how you would make like a trellis, right? So I'm going to take sales and I'm going to drop it here in the first one. And I'm going to take profit and drop it here. And now we've got the beginnings of our trellis. Now I'm going to throw some other things in here like discount and quantity. And all you have to make sure you do is you put them you just basically make the same order. Make sure they're in the same order in both columns and rows. And I'll throw profit. I did profit already. I'll throw profit ratio in here, and it's kind of a mess, right? But this is something that people often want to see. I just was rearranging them a little bit just so it made a little bit more sense. And so there's a trellis, all right? Now again, this might not be a very useful one right now, but I'm just showing you how you do it, all right? And I just want to use this to illustrate exactly what these columns and rows, the columns and rows shelf are doing, because it's doing exactly what we've asked it to do. It's created 5 columns of graphs and 5 rows of graphs, right? And so every one of these is an independent pane in our graph. And if we wanted to add annotation or different things, we could add it for the entire graph, for the entire row of graphs, or for each individual graph. And we'll talk about annotations in another video. All right? So this is a real simple video. I don't want to spend a ton more time on this about how you do a correlation graph. It's especially important on one of the assignments. So you will have to do a correlation plot like this for the duplicate Rosling assignment. And that's it.